Okay, we'll start with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah. I'm so glad to see all of you. Let me just admit 2 more people here. Great. Okay. I would like to do something this week that I don't usually do, which is I want to go back in time in our Parsha to talk about a question that I learned the answer to just since last week. And it was a question that's always kind of niggled at me a little bit. And so I wanted to share it with you because I thought you would appreciate it in general. And I think that it opens up a lot of other kind of thoughts and conversations about an idea. Excuse me. How many of you have heard, or who has heard before, the commentary that says that Rebecca, was 3 years old when she and Yitzchak got married? Did anybody ever hear that? Okay, so it's always kind of like, yeah, are you kidding me? Like, what does that even mean? That's kind of weird. So that's always, and just as an aside, that based on that 3-year-old idea, I think it's in, I can't speak for Chabad, I can't say that's for sure, but as I understand it, that there is a Chabad tradition, and there may be some other traditions also, that when a little girl reaches the age of 3, that she then starts to light 1 Shabbos candle. And there is an idea that 3 years old is a very powerful age, just like a little boy would have his upsharon, his haircut, and he would start Torah study, start the blessings. Yes. Patricia, did you have your hand up, or is that my, oh, okay, that's my little thing. I don't know how I got a hand, sorry. Okay. That there's the idea that at 3, that there is some sort of a blossoming, let's call it a blossoming of the neshama, the blossoming of the ability. If you remember yourself at 3 years old, or if you have nieces or nephews or grandchildren who are 3, you see them when they're 3 years old, they are who they are. You can tell who they are. And not that people can't change, they can change, but that people start to blossom in a certain way. So just as it is for a boy, so it is for a girl as well. So some people have the tradition of a little girl lighting 1 Shabbos candle, that she is a source of spiritual light. So, and this is based on the Rebecca thing of 3 years old, but it's always kind of sat like not so well with me, of like, what do you mean she was 3 years old? That's just a little strange. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore and go through the text. If you have a Chumash in front of you, that's great. If not, that's totally fine, because we'll be reading the passages out loud and you'll be able to see. So first we want to figure out, where does this 3 even come from? Who says it's 3? Does somebody just like pull that out of their hat? Where did that come from? So for that, we need to put together some dates we know and some hints at dates that we know, and then we'll be able to uncover this. So if you go to look at the beginning of Parshas Chaye Sarah, hold on a second, let me just let some people in here, sorry. Okay, if you go to look at the beginning of Parshas Chaye Sarah, you will notice a very famous line that tells us how old Sarah was when she died. So if you go to page 107 or chapter 23, verse 1, it says Sarah's lifetime was 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years. So how old was Sarah when she died? 127. And there's so much written about that. But we are just looking at it for the date information, the age information. If Sarah was 127 when she died, the question is, how old was Yitzchak at the time of the Akedah? How old was Yitzchak at the time of the binding of Isaac, which is what immediately precedes Sarah's death? All of the commentators, everyone agrees that Sarah died at the time of the Akedah, that there was, however people look at it, that's kind of a little bit of a separate conversation, but those things happened at the same time. Sarah died at the same time as the Akedah. If Sarah died at 127, how old was Yitzchak? These are the kind of math problems I like. So how old was Sarah? We can figure it out. How old was Sarah when Yitzchak was born? So we know that Abraham, exactly, Sarah was 90 years old. Abraham was 100 years old. So if Sarah was 90 when he was born, and she was 127 when she died, then we can do the math and figure out that Yitzchak was 37 years old. Okay, so 90 plus 37 equals 127. So she was 127 and Yitzchak was 37 years old. Okay, so now we know that. Now what's interesting, and here's the Rivka piece. The Rivka piece is on page 105. Let's see, hold on. Yes, on page 105. And it is this is right immediately after the Akedah. This is the Akedah story. And then we come to, and you can see if you have the stone chumash, it says in the margin there, the birth of Rebecca. And it says in verse 23, and Bethuel begot Rebecca. So Rebecca's birth is reported to be at the time of the Akedah. So now we have Yitzchak at the Akedah, Sarah's death, and Rivka's birth. Okay, and then the question is, how old then is Rivka when Isaac marries her? So we can find that out too, because that's also in the text. So let's go forward to that. When it talks about how old Isaac was when he married Rebecca. Hold on one second. The beginning of last week's Parsha on page 125. Hold on a second, letting more people in. We're trying to. Somebody's having difficulty. Okay. Page 125, it tells us, verse 20, Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, et cetera, as a wife for himself. So that gives us the information, that tells us the equation. The Akedah was when Yitzchak was 37. Sarah died at that time at the age of 127, and that Rivka was born. And then 3 years later, when Isaac was 40, he marries Rivka. This is where we get the equation that Rebecca was 3 years old, because well, she was born at the Akedah, Isaac was 37, and 3 years later, at the age of 40, is when he married her. So that's how she turns into being 3 years old. So you should have a problem with that, because we don't really do that. We don't marry 3-year-olds. I mean, I've seen I don't really remember myself at 3, so I can't comment. I can only talk about my children and grandchildren, and 3-year-olds are amazing. And I've seen some 3-year-old little girls, and they probably could run their own household if somebody would just let them. But we don't usually let them do that, and they're not at the age of consent. Now, we have to look at other evidence that shows us that Rivka was in no way 3 years old, and yet we have this 3 years old. So let's look at the evidence that shows us that she was not 3 years old. So how are we going to see that? So we're going to see two different ways. One is a halachic consideration, which is that when Eliezer goes to find a wife and finds Rebecca, that before Rebecca goes with Eliezer back to marry Isaac, she is asked, do you want to go with this man? So if you turn to page 119, this takes us back to Eliezer, who is with Rebecca's family. And they say in verse 57, and they said, meaning Rebecca's family, let us call the maiden and ask her decision. 58, they called Rebecca and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. Verse 59, so they escorted Rebecca, their sister, and her nurse, et cetera, and they blessed Rebecca. She had to be of the age of consent. Now, the age of consent in Jewish law is she would have to be at least the age of bat mitzvah. So she had to be at least 12 years old to give consent. And we have other halacha that comes from this that says, despite whatever movies or novels you've read, that a woman cannot be forced to marry somebody against her will. She has to be asked and she has to agree. And if she says no, then it's no. So we know then that she has to at least be 12 years old. How else do we know that she's older than 3 and is a young woman of some age? Is the description of her at the very beginning when Eliezer first meets her. When he first meets her, there's a description of her. And it's an interesting description that you wouldn't necessarily think would be so appropriate or necessary to share. And it's on page 113. Page 113, verse 15 and 16. And it was when he had not yet finished speaking, that's Eliezer, that suddenly Rebekah was coming out. She who had been born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife, etc., 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 with her jug upon her shoulder. Now, first of all, nobody in their right mind would send a 3-year-old out with the flocks. That doesn't make any sense. And that she would have a jug on her shoulder and would be, and it says that, she had a lot of alacrity and she had a lot of energy and enthusiasm, but nothing says that she was like of superhuman strength. So that would not have been, even in the strangest community, you don't send a 3-year-old out with the flocks, especially a little 3-year-old girl. But then it talks about how she looks. And it says, verse 16, now the maiden was very fair to look upon. That's also a description that you use for a young woman, not for a little girl. And then it goes on to say, a virgin whom no man had known. Now, you don't ever really describe a 3-year-old as a virgin. That's kind of really super weird language. You use that for a young woman, that she was a virgin that no man had ever known. Why do we even need to know that? Because we're going to find out later when Rebekah is going to leave her home and go with Eliezer to marry Isaac, that she wants to get out of there pretty quickly. And one of the reasons is that in those days, not unlike at the time of the Hanukkah story, a very horrible, I don't know what you call it, scenario unfolded, which is at the Hanukkah story, and this is we can talk about this for a moment because there's a connection, that on the wedding night, or when a girl got betrothed, the local governor got to sleep with her first before she was married to her husband. It's like really disgusting and outrageous and horrible. And this was also happened at the time of the Hanukkah story. That was one of the precipitating events. I have the information upstairs. Actually, I think it was the sister of one of the Maccabees was going to be married. And at her wedding, she basically dressed down to coin a phrase, she dressed down the men who were there. I think there's some midrash that says that she appeared naked at her wedding. And of course, everybody was appalled. And she said, like, you're appalled by this, but you're not appalled by the fact that I'm going to be raped by the governor tonight on my wedding night before I'm with my husband. And that she galvanized the men to fight. And because there were precipitating events that led to the revolt of the Maccabees. It wasn't, and they don't tell you this, they do not teach you this in Hebrew school or Sunday school. Actually, more kids might attend, but they don't tell you this part of the story. And this was a horrible thing. It is actually based on this idea and one other factor, that women are obligated in the lighting of the Hanukkah menorah. Usually, under most circumstances, women are not obligated in what are called time-bound mitzvahs. And lighting the Hanukkah menorah is a time-bound mitzvah. You light it at a certain time on a certain day, and that's called a time-bound mitzvah. I'm not really an expert in all the other ramifications of that, but there are exceptions, and one of the exceptions is the Hanukkah menorah, because it says the women were part of the miracle. And it doesn't just mean they benefited from the miracle, because you can say that about everything. Women benefit from everything in the Jewish world. It's not that they benefited from it, it's they were instrumental in causing and precipitating the miracle by galvanizing the men. So because of that, they have the obligation to light the Hanukkah menorah. So this was a common practice in ancient times. And Rebekah was in that kind of society. And the bigger challenge is her father, Bethuel, was the person who would have been the person to be with her. So that's why the text clarifies is that she had not been known by any man, and that there was going to be talk, if she got engaged, betrothed to Isaac, would her own father do that to her or not? And I'm sorry to say, he was of the kind of caliber that he might have. So she leaves. There's also another Midrashim that says that actually Bethuel died before he had a chance, that he would have had that intention to do that the night before. It's a kind of a different story, but basically what this is telling us is Rebecca was not 3 years old. She was a young woman. She was a young woman who needed to be concerned about her physical I have met, although it was, I'm not sure what you're talking about, Rachel. Sorry. Oh, okay. Okay. So I'm not saying like, yeah, okay. Okay, so thank you for the never. So it's a person would, it's not your normal thing. Okay, I'm glad you met somebody who's a 3-year-old who brought in the family's flock of sheep. It's a kind of a risky thing to do for a 3-year-old girl because they're more vulnerable and not usually as physically as strong. But I'm glad you met somebody. That being said, it was not exactly the normal thing for a 3-year-old girl to be doing this. It would have been a job for one of the boys. I'm not sure, that would have been a job for Laban rather than for Rebecca. Okay, so scratch the never and just say usually. And in this case, for Rebecca, it was unusual for her to be in that situation. Okay, so she is a young woman. We have the evidence, the halachic evidence, that she was asked whether she was willing to go with Eliezer. She said yes, and there was a concern about her virginity and whether she was going to be violated, not things that are normally associated with a 3-year-old. So now the question is, we're still stuck with the 3. What happened? So now we have to go to Yitzchak. What happened at the Akedah? So we usually focus on the binding of Isaac and the test of Abraham, and God said, bring him. And we're not going to talk about should he have or he didn't, or would he, should he objected, because we're not going to talk about that part of the story. What we want to talk about is what was the experience for Yitzchak. So everyone can agree that it was a profound experience. And we know because he was 37 years old, it's not like he was a little child. He was a willing, consenting adult to this whole process, whatever it meant. So there are different commentaries and midrashim that say that during that experience, it says the angels who saw him about to be, killed, that they started to cry, and that the angels' tears fell in Yitzchak's eyes. And that the angels' tears were tears of compassion. And those tears of compassion fell in his eyes. It was like receiving an infusion, an eye drop treatment. And it changed forever the way he perceived reality. And he perceived it only through the perspective of compassion. And the perspective of compassion is a great thing, except when it's misplaced. And it became misplaced in his perspective and perception of his son Esau. Of Esau later. He could not see the evil of Esau because he only could see his good. While it's a great thing to see people's good qualities, it's also very important to be aware of the shortcomings to protect yourself. You can't just go around like with, blinded. Like they say, love is blind. Okay, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? It depends. You can get very hurt if you don't see reality clearly. So Yitzchak had that impact from the angels. But even more than that is that there is commentary that says that Yitzchak's soul actually left him. It actually left him, not out of fear, but out of closeness to God. That experience was such almost like a magnetic force, that God was so close, the divine was so close, that his soul came out. Now we have another example of that. That same thing happened to the Jewish people standing at Mount Sinai. Is when we received the Torah, it says that when God said the first commandment to the Jewish people, that the experience that their souls left them and God had to put their souls back in. Then they had the second one, it left again, and their souls had to be put back in. And then after that, the Jewish people said, Moshe, you tell us the rest of it. Like, we can't go through this experience. So it's not that they fainted. It's not that they were scared. It was just such an overwhelming experience that God's presence was so close that it was like, again, like a magnet, that it like their souls went back to their source. We even have this idea every morning. What do we say? Moda ani lefanecha. And we thank God for restoring our souls to us. That there's something that when we're asleep and our body's physical defenses are down, that our neshama is, the moorings are loosened, and our neshama goes a little bit back to God. Not completely, otherwise we would be dead. But it goes a little bit, and we say, "Thank you, God, for restoring my soul to me, so that I'm back together." So we have a little bit more of a fluid understanding of neshama movement, comings and goings. So at the time of the binding of Isaac, says that his neshama left him, and that when it was re-ensouled, that this was more than just a near-death experience. This was a transformative experience that profoundly changed him forever. So now you have this person, Yitzchak, who has had this close encounter of the divine kind. And we know that his halachic status is such, he can't leave the land of Israel. That's why Eliezer goes to find him a wife. He can't go and find his own wife. Unlike his son Jacob, who in this week's Parsha is going to leave the land of Israel and go find his own wives. But Isaac couldn't go because he had the status of like a korban, of a sacrifice. And so he had to stay in the holy ground of the land of Israel. So now you have this person who is going to be the second patriarch, the second foundation of the Jewish people. Who is his wife supposed to be? We usually focus on Rebecca and Rivka, of her alacrity, her chesed, her kindness, her all these great things, and how she grew up in a family that was so antithetical to who she chose to become. And all of that is true. And yet, there's something that she needs something more. She needs something more in order to be the wife of Yitzchak. We have seen with Abraham and Sarah that their changes were parallel. When Avram turns to Avraham, Sarai is turned to Sarah. Avraham has a bris, and Sarah's body is restored or put into a place where she's able to have a child. They undergo parallel transformative processes in order, because they are partners. It is not the patriarchs. I just like, makes me crazy. Oh, it's a patriarchal society and the women are just blah, blah, blah. It's like, you don't understand the Torah. You're like missing the whole point. They are parallel, they are team, and each one is essential component to building the Jewish people. Yitzchak had this transformative experience. Who's he supposed to marry? It's great that she's kind and wonderful and amazing, but there needs to be some sort of turbocharge that matches something transformative. Now we're going to go back, and we're going to take a look now again at the birth of Rebecca. The birth of Rebecca at the end of Parshas Vayera, specifically right at the time of the Akedah on page 105. Right after this, it's like it doesn't even make sense. The whole Parsha is going on with all of the drama of the Akedah, and it's like going up to verse 18 on page 105, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your offspring, because you've listened to my voice. Abraham returned to his young man, and they stood up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham stayed at Beersheba. And then we get a little genealogy, and now we're told Rebecca was born. It's like, why are you interrupting the story to tell me this? And then the next thing that's going to happen is Sarah's death. It's like, what is happening? So it is reporting the birth of Rebecca. But what are sages? And it's a beautiful midrash that comes from, it is from the Midrash Hagadol, and additionally from Seder Olam. And it says that what happened is at the time that Yitzchak is experiencing the Akedah and the re-ensoulment after his soul leaves, is that Rebecca is getting a new soul added to hers. So she's going to become Rebecca plus. turbocharged Rebecca. She's going to get a new soul. And this is called, when you get a new soul, it's like a birth. You are reborn. We have, people in our community. We had Rabbi Rosenfeld of blessed memory. He was liberated from Auschwitz on Tu B'Shvat. He's always celebrated that as his birthday. There was another man, another shul, Fred Englard, who had a heart, something that happened to him. It was before we were members of Eidos. I think it was on Purim. And thankfully to the doctors who were in the shul and saved him, he celebrated that as his birthday. So thankfully he lived to be a very elderly man, but he would always say, like, I'm really only 37, I'm only whatever it was. He's started counting over. So that there is something about being ensouled, or when somebody converts to Judaism. In a way, you could say, I was reborn. That's what people say when they've had a religious experience. I was reborn. And you start counting anew, really. So you have your chronological age, and then you have the age of your soul experience. So what happens at that time? Rivka is born. She gets a new soul. And the question is, whose soul did she get? And our text tells us, basically, she gets Sarah's soul. Sarah is dying at that moment, and we're having this, if you can imagine this cosmic, it'd be a great movie, this cosmic experience that Yitzchak is being turbocharged into this close connection with God. Sarah is dying, her soul is going out, and it's going into Rivka. So that Rivka is now Rivka plus Sarah. She's both. She now is somebody who is going to be the powerhouse that is the appropriate mate for Yitzchak to be the second mother and the second father of the Jewish people. There is an allusion to it when Isaac marries Rebecca, going back to the Parsha Chaye Sarah again, on page 121, verse 67 of chapter 24. And Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. He married Rebekah, she became his wife, and he loved her, and thus was Isaac consoled after his mother. And the Rashi says on that it was, behold, it was Sarah, his mother, that Yitzchak recognized that Sarah had gone into Rivka, that it wasn't just that Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. It was, he brought her into the tent, and it says, Vayvieha Yitzchak ha'ohela Sarah imo, and he brought her into the tent, Sarah, his mother. Now, we're going to talk about the difference between the English and the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it says, Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother. That's not what it says in the Hebrew. It says, Vayvieha Yitzchak ha'ohela. That means he brought her, Yitzchak, he brought her into the tent. And then it says, Sarah imo, Sarah, his mother. It does not say ha'ohela shel Sarah imo, the tent of his mother, Sarah. It doesn't say ha'ohelat. This another way of saying the tent of Sarah, his mother. It says he brought her into her tent, Sarah, his mother. And that's why Rashi says, behold, it was Sarah, his mother. And that was, and thus was Isaac consoled after his mother. This wasn't just a young man who's not so young anymore, he's 37, who is consoled after the death of his mother, because like, now I have a wife and things are back. And we talked about that the mitzvot or the blessings that were on Sarah's tent came back with Rivka. But it's not just like, oh, you remind me of my mom. It's like, no, you are my mom. I see you are my mom. So this is the birth. So how old was then Rivka's new soul at the time of marrying Yitzchak? If she got her new soul at the time of the Akedah, Isaac was 37. Rivka gets her new soul. And then 3 years later, they are married. That means her new soul, she's 3, and Isaac is 40. So when we read this and you hear this, so even just as an aside, is a reminder that when you hear different midrashim and different commentaries, to realize that they need to be explored more deeply, and things are more complicated and more interesting and intriguing than they appear to be on the surface. And the stranger the commentary sounds, the more it should be investigated and not dismissed, because there's something very, very important that is being conveyed. Patricia.
So are you saying that she got Sarah's soul, 127-year-old soul?
Well, your soul is ageless. Your soul
Okay.
is not, doesn't have an age.
Okay, but so we don't, so we don't really know quite how old she was, but she was older than 3.
So one of the commentaries says here that says that some say that she was older. One state that she was 34 when then Yaakov was born, and therefore must have been 14 when she married Yitzchak. So that's kind of the agreed upon age, is that she's older than 12, but still young enough to be out there. So probably around 14, which, you know, I know to us that seems like a really early time, but, you know, my great grandmother was married at 17. You know, there are girls in different places that are easily, you know, Jewish girls in Mexico get married like 16, 17, as soon as they graduate high school, whatever, that's it. So not crazy. And, but then she was barren for a long time until she had the twins. So yes, so she is around that age. The soul knows no time, but it does know development. So Sarah's, in fact, there's an interesting reference. It says that a soul that comes into us is called Avraham, and when it leaves, it's called Sarah. That the idea that when your soul comes in at a certain level, and our job is to develop our soul's expression until we come to full potential, whatever we're able to do. And so it's called Sarah at the end. I don't know too much more than just those words that I'm saying, but that she gets Sarah's soul. And you might want to ask, like, so how does that happen? So first of all, we've already talked about that souls are kind of a fluid thing. We have the idea of reincarnation. I have a friend of mine in the community. When she had her little boy, he was born on the yahrzeit of her father-in-law. And when she saw him, she said, "Dad, you're back." That it was so clear to her that he was, yeah, you heard a good story recently that Thurman went to ask for bracha for shidduch as he, hold on one second, I want to hear the story, that there was a total awareness that the neshama had transferred. I shared a story with, I shared this, and a woman told me from one of my classes that her family has always perceived her as having the neshama of her great grandmother. And it was like really weird how it happened. Her mother, this woman, I'll just call her Jane. Jane's mother was pregnant with her and didn't know it at the time. Went to a hairdresser to have her hair dyed. And the colorist, who was a guy, said, I can't do it. There's another spirit here that's in you. There's like, your grandmother is here. She said, she's like, what are you talking about? She said, are you pregnant? And she said, no. And then she found out like a few weeks later that she was pregnant, and she gave birth to Jane, and who's named for this great grandmother. So it's like this neshama was hovering, and it was already in her. My own grandmother, I think I've shared this with you before, that, you know, my grandmother was not like a mystic, like not even close to a mystic. And I was with her one Tuesday, and I was helping her put her seatbelt on in our car, and she was having trouble doing it, just like the angle and not being able to see it clearly. And I thought she said to me, "You're acting like my mother," because I said, "Can I help you?" And that could be kind of insulting, like, "Can I help you with your seatbelt?" Like, you can't even put your seatbelt on. I said, "Oh, Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to act like your mother." She said, "Oh, I didn't say you're acting like my mother. I said, I think you are my mother. Like, you are my mother. And which is really interesting because my great grandmother passed away while my mother was pregnant with me, and I'm named for her. And it was like my mother's mother's mother. So it was like that line. And my grandmother's like, you are my mother. So, and it was, she just said it like, I'll have coffee with sugar and cream. I mean, she was like, I think you are my mother. So it was just very clear to her. And you'd be surprised if you raise this issue to people, you will hear all sorts of stories that people have about the souls coming. I think I shared with you, I think my little granddaughter, who's named for my mother, is my mother. I shared this with some of you. I think I shared it with you, but I'll just say it in the context of this, that when we were in Israel, that she said she's 3.5. She'll be 4, like right before Hanukkah. And she said, Omi, I'm so proud of you. Now, who says that? And I'm like, you are? Why? She goes, I just love you so much. And she told Benjamin, who was making her like a grilled cheese sandwich, you're such a good Abba, I just have to give you a hug. It's like, who talks like that? So she's, and she called me by herself on my birthday when I turned 65. She just told her mother, I'm calling Omi. She's like, do you know her number? And she said, yes, 303-333-0666, push 2 speaker. She's like, whoa. And she called me and just called to say happy birthday. I'm like, you are my mother. Like, you're my mom. So it's weird. And it's not just like, oh, we carry them in our heart and the memory of blah, blah, blah. It's like, yes, 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 yes. It's way more is going on than what we are really thinking about. So yes, this happens with our matriarchs and our patriarchs, and it's also happening. And sometimes the curtains part and they say, just take a deeper look here and see what's going on. That being said, is we also know that Sarah and Rebecca were biologically related as well. They are in the same family. So if you turn to the chart, again, if you have this Chumash on page 77, you can see what the relationship is between Sarah and Rebecca. So the chart on the bottom of 77 shows Sarah. Sarah had 2 siblings. She had a brother named Lot and a sister named Milcah. Milcah gave birth to Bethuel, and Bethuel was the father of Rebecca. So Rebecca is Sarah's grandniece. Okay, so she is already related. Now, do neshamas only go into related people? Maybe yes, maybe no. We have other stories of reincarnation where it's not related. We have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. They're not related. And we say that Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto is a reincarnation of Rabbi Akiva. They're buried next to each other in Tiberias. They're considered a soul connection, a reincarnation, not necessarily related that I know of other than they're Jewish. However, we do have another idea that somebody who is biologically related is maybe like, I don't know, maybe it's like when you're trying to have a donor for an organ or blood, that you can have like a closer match. I don't know like all the technical terms, but when they're looking for donors for matches, it's like, oh, they're a 5-point match or a 10-point match, whatever it might be. It may be that somebody who is biologically related is a good match, a good receiver for that neshama. So how do we kind of have a hint of that also in Jewish law? So we have the law of Yibum, which is Levirate marriage. Levirate marriage means that if a man dies, a married man dies without having had a child, his brother, his living brother, is supposed to marry the widow and bring a child out that will be in the memory of the deceased husband. And it's considered like a reincarnation of the husband. You could say, well, why is it a reincarnation of the husband? It's the brother. But we understand that when it says when a husband and wife have their first moment of intimacy, that the husband deposits his essence into her. Even more so than any future things, he deposits his essence into her, and it stays there until it comes out as a child. So if he dies without having had a child, it's like his potential did not get realized. You could say that's really sad, next time she, he'll whatever. But it's like, no, the brother or the closest male relative, somebody who is like, this is like a DNA thing, who is a biological similarity to the deceased husband, is the one who's supposed to marry her and bring out that essence of the deceased husband. This was the whole thing with Yehuda and Tamar. Janice.
Is that still done today in Orthodox communities?
I'm not sure what's done. The answer is no, because there's a whole thing that the brother can't really have any, that's kind of weird. He can't have sexual attraction. He has to be doing it for the sake of the mitzvah. And on the other hand, who would want to marry somebody who do it? I'm like, I'm not really attracted to you. I'm just doing this for the mitzvahs. Like, what kind of thing is that? So it's still on the books, but I don't know what's done with it. But I do know that people have done it, more so like after the Holocaust, when people died, and it wasn't necessarily someone who died childless, but brothers married if the husband was deceased and the brother married the widow, and to kind of carry on the family. But it's not just the family name, it's the husband, that there's something about bringing it the husband. It's considered a reincarnation of the brother. So much so that this is in the story with Yehuda and Tamar. Tamar was Yehuda's daughter-in-law. Yehuda had 3 sons. Tamar married the oldest son, and he sinned before God, and so he was killed. And then the second son, marries Tamar, but he doesn't really want to give his brother like a wife. He doesn't want to do the mitzvah for his brother, and so he withholds. That's onan, that's onanism, where you withdraw prematurely and don't allow the conception to happen. And so God kills him too. So then Yehuda tells Tamar, go back to your father's house, and when my young son grows up, I'll give you him. And then he doesn't do it. And that's when Tamar's like, okay, Yehuda's not giving me the sons, so I'm going for him. And that's when she does the dress up thing and has relations with him. And it's like, we're going to make this happen one way or another, because this is how we have this continuity, but it is following through the genetic line. So there is something about the person who is in the family, and maybe this is why, this is me, this is not any, maybe this is why when Abraham tells Eliezer, go back to my family, to my land, to find a wife for Isaac, and where Rebecca is going to tell Jacob, go to my family, and he'll take a family from there, because all the mothers and fathers, they're all related. Either they're the birth or they are already all in the family, that there's some kind of thing there that is potential, that has the ability to come out and express itself, that's the right match. So the only thing you can think about is like when you have a donation of an organ or blood or platelets or whatever, bone marrow, that you find out, it's like, well, there has to be some sort of a match. So Rebecca was already a DNA match person for Sarah's neshama. Okay, she was already kind of in the Parsha. She's already kind of part of it. And it can't just be that, because there were rotten people who were in Sarah's family too. So it has to be somebody who has the potential and who also has made their own personal decisions and has made themselves into a worthy receptacle, a worthy receiver of the neshama. So it couldn't be that there's this, kind of crummy girl in the family, and Sarah's neshama is going to rest on her, and she's going to turn into a magnificent person. It has to be somebody who's already like as good as they is already a great person, who then can receive the neshama of somebody as great as Sarah, to kind of turbocharge her power and her ability in this world. So when Isaac marries Rebecca, he's marrying her, but he's marrying kind of like this double powered. He himself is double powered, and he needs a wife who is as well. And then isn't it kind of, this is me, this isn't the commentary. I find it interesting then that then Rebecca is going to be pregnant with twins, that she's going to have two, as she's told, you have two nations inside of you, not just two kids. You have two nations inside of you. It's like, wow, how'd you get that? It's like, well, you have to be strong. You have to be a person who is going to be able to carry that, to create that and to carry it. And she does. And Rebecca is very much so. That's why I said in my email, does Rebecca remind you of somebody? She should remind you of Sarah. When Sarah was the one who goes to Abraham to tell him that Hagar and Ishmael cannot stay in the family because Ishmael is a mortal threat to Yitzchak. People like to say, oh, that Sarah was jealous. She was not jealous. She was not jealous. She recognized the existential threat to Isaac and says, Hagar and Ishmael need to go. Abraham's like, that's my son. God says, listen to Sarah. Rebecca had it even harder. She had to discern wickedness in her own child. It's one thing for Sarah to see it in Hagar's child of Ishmael. It's a whole other thing to see it in your own child. To be able to be discerning and to figure out what to do. To make sure that the prophecy that Rebecca received, which was, the elder shall serve the younger. Esau was the elder and Jacob was the younger. So she knew that it needed to work out that the elder will serve the younger, which means that it needed to be that Jacob received the blessing. So people always want to say, why didn't she just tell Isaac? Why didn't she just say, you know, honey, I just have to sit down and tell you, you're just not seeing our kids clearly. You know, it's really Jacob that should have the blessing. Many reasons this doesn't work. One is, first of all, the prophecy went only to Rebecca. God did not say, the sages did not say to her, tell your husband. Prophecies are considered private unless you're told to share. So it was information for her to have. Okay, that's interesting. That's one piece. The second piece is, when was the last time you successfully told somebody, contradicted their perspective and belief system on something that they were very emotionally attached to? So, you know, I'm just going to sit down with you and tell you the truth. I don't know about you, but I haven't had much success with that. You're like, oh, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And the third is, we already talked about Yitzchak. Yitzchak wasn't just like, oh, I have an affinity for Esav. He couldn't see Esav's negative qualities because of his own experience of the Akedah. Going back to the angel's tears, he had a perspective and a perception of Esav. There wasn't anything Rebecca could say. It wasn't like, oh, you know, she should have just gotten up the courage. Rebecca was not wanting for courage. She was practical. It's like, what's going to work? And that's what she does. And she pays a very, very steep price for it. She pays the price of this week's Parsha, Vayetze, of Jacob has to flee, and she never sees him again. Okay, that's pretty steep. It's a very steep price that she pays. So you can do the right thing, and it can still end up being a very difficult, challenging decision. Patricia.
Do you think that when Rachel agreed to have Leah marry
Yaakov.
Yaakov,
Yes.
that she had a prophecy to, besides doing the right thing by her sister or whatever, was there some prophecy that had to be fulfilled that Rachel knew about for Leah? I don't know.
Such a great question. I don't think so, but I will tell you something else, which is just so challenging. It could be that let's go to when Jacob meets Rachel. They have a very strange first date. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. When he meets Rachel on page 149, verse 11, it says, then Jacob kissed Rachel. This was in a familial way, not a passionate way. And it says, and he raised his voice and wept. Raising his voice and wept This is the same phrase that's used when Esau finds out that he didn't get the blessing. It says he raised his voice and wept. This kind of raising your voice and wept is not like, oh, my long lost relative. This is something precious is being taken from me. It's like, why is it the same? What was being taken from him? He was meeting her. It says that Jacob had a prophecy that he was not going to be with Rachel, that she was always going to be elusive to him. So how is she elusive? From the beginning, he has to work for her for 7 years. And then she switched with Leah, and Rachel doesn't tell Yaakov this. She takes that on, and she allows the switching. She allows that to happen. And then Rachel dies in childbirth. And then she's not buried with him in the cave of Machpelah. It's like, did he ever really have her? It's like he never really had her. And that's what he knew, is that somehow he wasn't going to really have her. And so he raises his voice and weeps. And then there's some that hold the conversation about, is this measure for measure because he took something away from his brother, who after all was his twin brother, and caused him to raise his voice and weep, even though it was the right thing. Again, something could be the right thing and still be painful. So Yaakov there had been a plan A for Yaakov. Yaakov's plan A was that he saw that he knew he needed to marry both Rachel and Leah. The reason he had to marry Rachel and Leah is because Rachel was destined for him and Leah was destined for Esau. We know it says that Leah's eyes were tender, and it says they were tender because she was always crying, begging and praying that she not have to marry Esau, the wicked person, and that God answered her prayers. It's like, you'll marry Jacob. Yaakov also bought the birthright of Esau. He got the blessing that should have gone to Esau, but was really meant for him. In other words, Yaakov really becomes a person who has a dual identity. He takes on what Esau should have been in the world, that he stepped away from and rejected. It's like Jacob this is like when you work for the company and somebody leaves and they give you both jobs, but they don't actually give you a promotion. So this was Jacob. He's like, now I have to be Jacob and Esau, which really means I need to marry both of them because these women were destined for them. Because people had always said, the elder will marry the elder, the younger will marry the younger. Jacob and Rachel, you can just imagine the family get together. Oh, they're so cute. Esau and Leah, and Rachel and Jacob. So Jacob knew that he had to marry both of them. But plan A, or you could say this is plan B. Plan A would be that Esau would be a righteous person and he would marry Leah, and Jacob would marry Rachel. Things get confusing when you take on a dual identity. Then he's like, I need Rachel and Leah in order to build the Jewish people. How's that going to work? So the Torah prohibits a man from marrying sisters in their lifetime. You can't have two sisters who are your wives at the same time. One has to be deceased, and then you can marry the sister. So plan A is that he saw that Rachel was going to die in childbirth. So plan A was to marry Rachel. She would die in childbirth, and then he would marry Leah, and she would give birth to the rest of the children. And in that way, he would be married to both in a 100% kosher way. The 12 tribes would be born, and he would fulfill the task. When Laban switches them, that's what throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing. When we talk about that Laban tried to destroy my father, that's we say that at Pesach. There was an Aramean who tried to destroy my father. It's talking about destroying Jacob. What does that mean? It's like he did this to their relationship of Leah and Rachel, contorted it, introduced all the heartache that went into those sisters being married to the same person at the same time. And Rachel's then out of the cave of Machpelah because in the land of Israel, you can't have a man buried with two wives who were sisters in their lifetime. It's like there's lots of reasons why Rachel's not there. So the whole thing is just like so complicated and so deep. And you think about who needs to be the parents of Jacob, this person, and of Esau, because he turns into the Roman Empire. That's Esau, Western civilization. Like, who are the parents of these people? The parents of these people have to be people who are like on a whole different level. Isaac and Rebekah. And they are the only ones that, even when Rebekah was barren, not giving birth for so long, she didn't suggest, nor did he suggest, that they marry, that he bring in somebody else. Sarah had that idea, bring in Hagar. Rachel and Leah had that idea, bring in Bilhah and Zilpah and create more children. But Isaac and Rebekah are like this pure, powerful connection that needs to fuel the next generation that comes out with Jacob and the 12 children, the 12 sons and the 12 tribes that becomes the Jewish people. So they are a very interesting link in the chain. And I just kind of picture this again, if this was a movie, I picture like, lightning flashes and the cosmos going, whirling. And as the soul transfers are happening, it's like, this is what needs to happen. And the people, it's not just happening to passive people who are just standing by and then unwittingly these things happen to them. These are people who are themselves making choices about how they live their lives, what people they have made themselves into becoming and being, that makes them receptors, receivers, good matches for the power that is given them and is put into them, into their lives. So now when we hear Rebekah was 3 when she married Isaac, we have a whole new understanding of what that 3 means. She was a young woman chronologically, but her neshama, she had had that new neshama for 3 years, and it had time to gel in her. It's kind of like after, again, like an organ donation. It's like, did it take? It's like, you could be like, no, incompatible host, and that it's not like you have a drug, it's for an anti-rejection drugs or something. It's like, you have to be a good host to hang on to that neshama. So she had that 3 years stuck. Isaac married her. And then when he takes her into the tent, took her into her tent, pause, Sarah, his mother. And there she was. And that provides the person who becomes the next mother of the Jewish people. So hopefully you'll be also inspired to think about whose neshamas you carry and where those neshamas are. I remember people saying to my mom, she was getting older, don't you miss like all the people in your family who have passed away? And she's like, I mean, on one hand, yes. And she goes, no, she said, I see them. They're like right here in front of my eyes. This one is this one, and this one is that one. And they've got their smile and the way they walk and the way they talk. And they're like all right there. So we just need to open our eyes and realize that things are much more complicated. We tend to have a childish stick figure perception of reality, very superficial, flat, instead of a Rembrandt of knowing that there's so much beneath the surface, that things are going on. Just open our eyes and see it. So I'm grateful that in the Parsha that the curtains parted and that we're given a hint. It's like, look and see what's really happening here, what's going on, and who we are made of. What this also tells us is that we are the descendants of those people, which means we also have a spiritual and a physical, both DNA connection to these people, and which means that we inherit. And that's why we say when we connect in our davening, we start off God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. We're not just like name dropping. It's like we're saying we're part of their account. We are a continuation of that. But we have to connect ourselves to that continuation. Otherwise, we become a potential match, but not a match that actualizes. So we want to be a potential match and an actualized match for our mothers and our fathers that are all inside of us. We have so many generations of greatness. Otherwise, we would not be sitting here today if those people didn't do what they did to get us where we are, regardless of what our stories are. Okay, thank you for letting me share that with you. I was so excited to learn it. And I'm like, how I never saw this before, and it's, as I said, it's always been kind of sitting there with me, and I was happy to learn more information. Any comments, questions, anything else that anybody wanted to say or share? Patricia?
Sorry. So I have a question back to page 77,
Sure.
that family tree. And why is there a line between Mahalath and Esau?
Hold on one second. Between, say
Mahalath,
again,
Mahalath and Esau. See that little line? You see,
I'm looking at Rebecca.
you see Isaac, and then you see Jacob.
Oh, Esau, yes, he married her.
Oh, gotcha. Okay,
He
sorry.
married her. So he married her, and I'll tell you when it says at the end of, is it at the end of Toldot? Look on page 143 of the text. This is Esau. Verse 8. Then Esau perceived that the daughters of Canaan were evil in the eyes of Isaac his father. Never mind that his mother already said that she was disgusted because of the Canaanite women that Esau had married. Okay, that was, let's see, if you go back to page 141, verse 46. Rebecca said to Isaac, I'm disgusted with my life. You just see such a Jewish mother. I'm disgusted with my life on account of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth like these, of the daughters of the land, what is life to me? Meaning that Esau had married Canaanite women, and which was very bad. And his mother made it known, but his father, was not registering. But then finally, Esau perceives that the daughters of Canaan were evil in the eyes of Isaac, his father. Esau had much more regard for his father than for his mother. It's not a good thing. So it says, so then he makes another mistake. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, son of whatever, in addition to his wives as a wife for himself. So he didn't divorce the Canaanite wives, he just added an Ishmaelite wife to it. So that's why that goes on, and it connects the family of Ishmael with Esau, which is also it has like dramatic foreshadowing of the Christian and Islamic world being unified, and of the challenge to the Jewish people, the descendants of Jacob. So we can look at all sorts of interesting historical events of how that has worked. It says that you have a very challenging combination when Esau gets together with Ishmael, then we have some interesting things happen. So that's why that line is connected. So great question. All right, anybody else? Yes, anybody else? Janice.
So I just wanted to share a story. When my kids were small, my son was about 5 months old, and my mother-in-law was coming to visit. Her husband, my father-in-law, had died a couple years earlier, and she was coming to visit and see the kids. And so I took him with me to the airport and left the other two with the babysitter. And so he's maybe 4 or 5 months old, and I'm holding him back at the time when you could go down to the gate and collect people as they came off the plane.
The good old days.
Yeah. And so we're just standing there, and I'm holding this baby, and I see her, coming off the plane and walking a little bit. All of a sudden, he leaps out of my arms towards her. And, I had to grab him to keep him from falling. And, he's named for my father-in-law, and we always joke that they were similar, or that they are, similar, but that just has stuck with me. It's like, how much more clear could it be when he jumped to her? And so
interesting, really interesting. And if we think about it,
I mean, he had never seen her before, and they were just these people coming off the plane.
And he just jumped to her.
Yeah. So.
Yep.
There's so much more than we know.
Yes. And the challenge is in our Western, I'll call it overly rational world, where everything has to fit into a nice, you know, little box. We don't have any place to put these stories.
Yes.
And so we dismiss them. And we think, oh, no, that's not, you know, it wasn't really anything. It's just like, you know, an exuberant baby, like that, just, it becomes like a sweet anecdote instead of evidence. It's like, pay attention, like open your eyes and see what's happening here. There's something else going on. So I'll tell you, my granddaughter, other granddaughter, Shifra, is named for Steve's mother. She just turned 6 last week. So she was 5+ this summer. She talks about, she says, I love grandma. Of course, she never met her because she's named for her. She says, I just love grandma. She gave me her name. Like she like presented it to her. That's her perception of it. So our kids were coming down from the mountains this summer, and they stopped at Golden Hill Cemetery, which is where my in-laws are buried, because they wanted to be buried there because of the view of the mountains. And they just say, you know, maybe you'll come visit us like on your way down from the mountains. So Benjamin and Dahlia stop at the cemetery. Now, sometimes I usually place where little kids want to go. And the kids were in the car, and Dahlia was pregnant, so she actually didn't go into the cemetery because there's a whole thing about pregnant women not being in the cemetery. But Shiffy said, I want to go see where grandma is. I want to go see grandma. So they said, well, you know, it's not really grandma, you know, it's where her body is. She goes, I know, I want to go see her. And they thought, she's going to be scared. She's going to be freaked out. She's like, no, she wanted to go say hello to grandma. And just love grandma. She gave me her name. So we need to take these things more seriously. And honestly, it's also quite comforting. And to remember, this isn't crazy. In the bedtime Shema, standard art scroll, not New Age, when we say we forgive people, that we go to bed and I forgive people who've harmed me, who this way, that way, and we say whether in this incarnation or a previous incarnation. And the idea is that like there is more fluidity, that if I'm having an issue with somebody, it could be that it's an issue from a previous incarnation that has somehow traveled through time and come back to be still resolved in this time. And we should not just be so linear in our thinking. There's just a lot more going on. All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining me. Have a great Shabbos, and I will see you next week.
Thank you, Ellyn.
Have a good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom. Oh, Rachel, I see your story. I missed that. Engaged and married to a convert. Oh, that is so, so interesting. I love that.